Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in Deadwood history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are hearing this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In 1856, before Deadwood became the notorious gold rush town that would later capture the imagination of the American frontier, the Black Hills region of Dakota Territory was little more than scattered claims and temporary settlements. The discovery of gold in French Creek had begun to draw prospectors, but the area remained largely unexplored wilderness, inhabited by the Lakota Sioux and a handful of hardy miners willing to risk everything for the promise of fortune beneath the dark pine forests. It was during this early period that one of the most disturbing cases in territorial history began to unfold, centered around three men whose names would become whispered warnings among those who dared to venture into the remote gulches and hidden valleys of what would one day become Lawrence County, South Dakota. The case of Caleb Rawlins, Isaac Boone, and the events that transpired in the winter of 1856 would challenge everything the sparse community thought they understood about the men who sought their fortunes in the unforgiving wilderness. The story begins not with violence or dramatic confrontation, but with something far more unsettling, the gradual realization that some silences are not empty, but filled with secrets too terrible to speak aloud. Caleb Rawlins arrived in the Black Hills region in the early autumn of 1855, leading a small party of prospectors from Missouri. At 28 years old, he was described by those who knew him as a methodical man, neither particularly friendly nor hostile, with the kind of steady demeanor that inspired confidence in business dealings. His weathered journal, discovered years later during a surveying expedition, reveals a man obsessed with documenting every detail of his daily activities, from the quality of stream water to the precise weight of gold dust recovered each day. Rawlins had established his claim along a narrow creek approximately 15 miles southwest of what would later become Deadwood proper, in a valley so remote that neighboring prospectors were separated by miles of dense forest and rocky terrain. The isolation was intentional. Rawlins had learned, through bitter experience in the California goldfields, that successful mining required not just hard work and luck, but absolute secrecy about one's discoveries. Isaac Boone joined Rawlins's operation in late November of 1855, arriving alone on a lame horse with little more than basic mining tools and a peculiar intensity that made other men uncomfortable. Boone claimed to be 31 years old, though his appearance suggested someone who had lived a harder life than his years would indicate. His hands bore the scars of previous mining accidents, and he possessed an uncanny ability to identify promising geological formations that had earned him a reputation as either exceptionally lucky or somehow unnatural. The third member of their small group was a man known only as Thomas Wright, about whom little reliable information exists. Wright appears to have been younger than his companions, possibly in his early 20s, and served primarily as a laborer and camp cook. Unlike Rawlins and Boone, Wright left no written records, and accounts of his personality come only from brief mentions in Rawlins's journal and later testimony from visiting prospectors. The three men worked the claim through the harsh winter of 1855 into 1856, sharing a crude cabin constructed from local timber and chinked with mud and moss. Rawlins's journal entries from this period describe a routine of methodical work, with each man assigned specific responsibilities and strict rules about venturing away from the immediate area of their claim. The isolation was complete. The nearest settlement was a 3-day ride through difficult terrain, and communication with the outside world was limited to monthly supply runs undertaken by whoever drew the short straw among the three partners. It was during one of these supply runs, in March of 1856, that the first indication of something amiss reached the outside world. A prospector named James Morrison, returning from the territorial capital, encountered Isaac Boone at a trading post approximately 40 miles south of the claim. Morrison later told authorities that Boone appeared agitated and repeatedly asked whether Morrison had seen any strangers in the area, particularly anyone asking questions about mining claims or the whereabouts of specific individuals. Boone's behavior during this encounter was described as erratic. He purchased an unusual quantity of salt and preserved meat, far more than 3 men could reasonably consume, and spent considerable time examining firearms, though he ultimately made no purchase. Most disturbing to Morrison was Boone's apparent paranoia about being followed. The man repeatedly glanced over his shoulder and insisted on conducting their conversation in hushed tones, despite the fact that they were alone in the trading post. When Morrison asked about Rawlins and Wright, Boone's response was curt and evasive. He claimed both men were well but busy with work that required their complete attention. Morrison noted that Boone seemed eager to end the conversation and departed the trading post with unusual haste, heading back toward the Black Hills along a route that would take him through some of the most treacherous terrain in the territory. This encounter, recorded in Morrison's own journal and later corroborated by the trading post proprietor, would prove to be the last confirmed sighting of any member of the Rawlins party by outside witnesses for several months. What transpired during those months remains one of the most disturbing mysteries in the early history of the Dakota Territory, a puzzle that would not begin to reveal its horrible truth until the following autumn. The spring and summer of 1856 passed without incident, at least as far as the outside world was concerned. The Black Hills region was entering a period of increased activity as word of gold discoveries spread eastward, drawing new waves of prospectors and adventurers. Several new claims were established in the general vicinity of Rawlins's operation, though the difficult terrain and harsh conditions meant that contact between different mining parties remained sporadic and informal. It was not until September of 1856 that questions began to arise about the fate of the 3 men. A surveying party working for the territorial government had been tasked with mapping potential routes for future roads, and had been directed to investigate several established claims to determine their exact boundaries for official records. The Rawlins claim was among those on their list, and the surveyors expected to find the 3 men still working the site. What they discovered instead was a settlement that appeared to have been abandoned for weeks, possibly months. The cabin remained structurally sound, but the mining equipment had been left scattered and unused. No signs of recent human activity were evident, and the creek showed no indication that any work had been performed since the spring snowmelt. Most puzzling was the fact that personal belongings remained in the cabin, including Rawlins's extensive journal collection and what appeared to be a significant quantity of gold dust stored in carefully labeled containers. The surveying party, led by a territorial official named Samuel Pierce, conducted a preliminary search of the immediate area but found no trace of the 3 men. Pierce's official report, filed with territorial authorities in October of 1856, noted the unusual circumstances but recommended no immediate action, as abandonment of mining claims was not uncommon and the men might have relocated their operation to a more promising site. However, Pierce included in his report a detail that would later prove significant. Among the personal effects left in the cabin was a leather-bound journal that appeared to contain Rawlins's handwriting, but covered only the period through February of 1856. The journal entries ended abruptly in the middle of a routine daily record, with no indication of plans to leave the claim or any explanation for the cessation of regular documentation. Pierce noted that this was particularly strange, given Rawlins's apparent obsession with detailed record-keeping throughout the previous year. More disturbing was Pierce's observation that the cabin's interior showed signs of what he termed unusual wear patterns. Scratches on the wooden walls appeared to have been made from the inside, and several pieces of furniture had been damaged in ways that suggested violent struggle. The door frame showed evidence of repeated impacts, and the wooden floor bore stains that Pierce could not identify but described as concerning in their distribution and appearance. Pierce's report reached the desk of Territorial Marshal William Crawford in late October. Crawford, an experienced lawman who had dealt with numerous cases of missing persons in the wilderness, recognized elements in Pierce's account that warranted further investigation. Crawford assembled a small party of deputies and began the difficult journey to the abandoned claim in early November, just as winter weather was beginning to make travel increasingly hazardous. The marshal's party reached the site after 3 days of difficult travel through increasingly hostile terrain. Crawford's subsequent report to territorial authorities provides the first detailed documentation of the disturbing evidence that would transform a simple missing persons case into something far more sinister. Crawford noted immediately that the site had been disturbed since Pierce's visit. Someone had returned to the cabin and made efforts to remove or conceal evidence of whatever had transpired there. Several containers that Pierce had noted as containing gold dust were now empty, and papers that had been described in the surveyor's report were missing entirely. Most significantly, Rawlins's journals had been removed, leaving only scattered pages that appeared to have been deliberately torn from their bindings. The marshal's party conducted an extensive search of the surrounding area, expanding their investigation to include terrain within several miles of the cabin. It was during this expanded search that they made discoveries that would haunt the investigators for years to come. Approximately 1 mile upstream from the cabin, partially concealed beneath a pile of rocks that appeared to have been carefully arranged, Crawford's deputies discovered what they initially believed to be animal remains. Closer examination revealed fabric fragments and metal objects that suggested human origin. The remains were scattered and incomplete, making identification impossible, but the location and manner of concealment strongly suggested that they were dealing with evidence of violence rather than natural death or accident. More disturbing was the discovery of a second cache approximately half a mile in the opposite direction. This site contained personal effects that were later identified as belonging to Thomas Wright, including a distinctive belt buckle that had been described by Morrison during his encounter with Boone at the trading post. The condition and distribution of these items suggested that they had been buried with considerable care, then later disturbed and partially excavated. Crawford's investigation uncovered no trace of Caleb Rawlins, alive or dead. However, evidence suggested that someone had been living at the claim for some time after the disappearance of his partners. Food stores had been consumed in patterns inconsistent with 3 men, but suggesting long-term habitation by a single individual. Most tellingly, the mining work had continued well into the summer, with fresh diggings and recently processed ore indicating that the claim had remained active months after Wright, and potentially Rawlins had vanished. The marshal's report includes a chilling detail that would become central to later speculation about the case. Among the items found in the cabin was a collection of crude drawings that appeared to document the progressive isolation and deterioration of the small community. The drawings, executed in charcoal and what appeared to be dried blood, showed figures in various states of distress and depicted scenes that Crawford described as unsuitable for official documentation, but which clearly indicated that the final weeks at the claim had been marked by escalating psychological breakdown. Crawford concluded his initial investigation with the working theory that Isaac Boone had murdered his partners, probably during the winter months, and had continued operating the claim alone until circumstances forced him to abandon the site. The marshal issued warrants for Boone's arrest and circulated descriptions to law enforcement agencies throughout the territory and neighboring states. However, no credible sightings of Boone were ever reported, and the man seemed to have vanished as completely as his victims. The case might have ended there, filed away as another instance of frontier violence motivated by greed and isolation, had it not been for events that unfolded the following spring. In April of 1857, a new party of prospectors arrived in the Black Hills region and, unaware of the previous year's events, established a claim approximately 3 miles from the abandoned Rawlins site. Within weeks, these newcomers began reporting disturbing occurrences that suggested the story of 1856 was far from over. The new prospectors, led by a man named Daniel Foster, initially dismissed the strange incidents as the product of wilderness isolation and overactive imaginations. They reported hearing sounds from the direction of the abandoned claim during the night, including what they described as machinery operations and human voices. Several members of Foster's party claimed to have seen smoke rising from the cabin area during daylight hours, though investigations of the site revealed no signs of recent habitation. More unsettling were the discoveries Foster's men began making while working their own claim. Personal effects that appeared to match descriptions of items belonging to the missing men began turning up in creek beds and among rock formations miles from the original site. These discoveries suggested that someone had been systematically scattering evidence across a wide area, possibly in an effort to prevent the kind of concentrated investigation that Crawford had conducted. In June of 1857, Foster himself encountered a figure watching their operation from a ridge approximately 1 mile distant. The man appeared to match physical descriptions of Isaac Boone and observed the miners' activities for several hours before disappearing into the forest. Foster attempted to pursue the figure but lost the trail in difficult terrain. That night, Foster's party discovered that their food stores had been raided and several tools had been stolen, though the theft had been conducted with such care that the losses were not immediately apparent. These incidents escalated throughout the summer of 1857. Members of Foster's party reported finding bizarre constructions in the forest surrounding their claim. Elaborate arrangements of human and animal bones, crude shelters that appeared to have been occupied recently, and what one witness described as altars or shrines decorated with objects that had belonged to the missing men. The psychological effect on Foster's crew was devastating. 3 men abandoned the claim before midsummer, and by August, Foster himself was making plans to relocate the operation to a different area. The final incident that drove Foster's party from the region occurred in late August of 1857. Foster had posted guards around their camp following a series of thefts and disturbances, and it was one of these guards who witnessed what he later described as the most terrifying experience of his life. During the pre-dawn hours, the guard observed a figure approaching the camp with what appeared to be deliberate intent. As the figure drew closer, the guard realized that the intruder was carrying what looked like human remains. The guard raised an alarm, and Foster's entire party responded with weapons ready. In the confusion that followed, the intruder disappeared into the darkness. But dawn revealed evidence that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Arranged around the perimeter of their camp were fragments of human bone and tissue, along with items of clothing and personal effects that Foster recognized as belonging to Thomas Wright and possibly Caleb Rawlins. Foster's party abandoned their claim the following morning and made the dangerous journey to the nearest settlement, where they reported their experiences to territorial authorities. Marshal Crawford, who had never closed his investigation of the original disappearances, returned to the Black Hills region with a larger force of deputies and several volunteers from local settlements. Crawford's second investigation proved far more extensive than his original inquiry. The Marshals Party spent weeks combing the area, documenting the bizarre constructions that Foster's men had reported and uncovering evidence of long-term habitation by someone who appeared to be living in a state of complete psychological breakdown. Hidden camps were discovered throughout the region, each containing evidence of increasingly erratic behavior and what could only be described as ritualistic activities involving human remains. The investigation culminated in a confrontation that would provide the final, horrifying chapter of the Deadwood case. Following a trail of increasingly fresh sign, Crawford's party tracked their quarry to a remote canyon approximately 10 miles from the original claim. There, they discovered Isaac Boone, barely recognizable after more than a year of wilderness living, existing in conditions that challenged every assumption about human survival and sanity. Boone had constructed an elaborate settlement in the canyon, using materials salvaged from abandoned claims and natural features to create a complex that served both as living quarters and what could only be described as a shrine to his murdered partners. The remains of Thomas Wright and Caleb Rawlins had been preserved and arranged in a grotesque display that suggested Boone had been conducting ongoing conversations with his victims for months. The confrontation between Crawford's party and Boone lasted several hours. The fugitive initially attempted to flee deeper into the canyon, but was cornered in a box canyon with no escape route. According to Crawford's report, Boone's behavior during the capture suggested complete mental collapse. He alternated between violent resistance and attempts to introduce his captors to his deceased partners, apparently believing that Wright and Rawlins were still alive and present at the scene. Boone was transported to the territorial capital, where he was examined by the territory's only qualified physician. The doctor's report, preserved in territorial archives, describes a man whose experiences had rendered him fundamentally incapable of distinguishing between reality and delusion. Boone claimed that his partners were still alive and working the claim, and he became violent when contradicted. He insisted that he had been protecting Wright and Rawlins from threats that only he could perceive, and he demonstrated detailed knowledge of conversations and events that could only have occurred if his victims had remained alive for months after their apparent deaths. The trial of Isaac Boone, conducted in December of 1857, became a spectacle that drew observers from throughout the territory and neighboring states. The bizarre nature of the evidence and Boone's obvious mental incapacity created legal challenges that territorial courts were ill-equipped to handle. Boone's behavior in the courtroom was consistently erratic. He frequently addressed empty chairs as if his former partners were present and became agitated when court officials attempted to correct his misconceptions. The prosecution's case was complicated by the difficulty of establishing exactly when and how the murders had occurred. The condition of the remains made forensic determination impossible, and Boone's own testimony was too unreliable to provide any clarity about the sequence of events. The defense argued that Boone was incapable of understanding the nature of his actions and should not be held legally responsible for crimes committed during a period of obvious mental breakdown. The trial lasted 3 days and concluded with a verdict that satisfied no one involved. Boone was found guilty of the murders of Thomas Wright and Caleb Rawlins, but was sentenced to life imprisonment in the territorial facility rather than execution in recognition of his obvious mental incapacity. The judge's final statement noted that the case had revealed aspects of human psychology that existing legal frameworks were inadequate to address. Isaac Boone died in territorial custody in 1859. Less than 2 years after his capture. Prison records indicate that he never recovered his ability to distinguish between reality and his delusions, and he continued to insist until his death that his partners were still alive and waiting for him to return to their claim. Guards reported that he spent hours each day conducting elaborate conversations with invisible companions, and that he became violent when prevented from carrying out what he described as his responsibilities to Wright and Rawlins. The Black Hills region where these events occurred was abandoned by prospectors for several years following Boone's capture. Reports of strange occurrences continued to emerge from the area, though most were attributed to the psychological effects of isolation and the lingering influence of the notorious case. When gold rush activity resumed in the 1870s, the sites associated with the Rawlins claim were deliberately avoided, and the area acquired a reputation that discouraged settlement. Modern investigation of the case has been hampered by the loss of most official records during various territorial reorganizations and natural disasters. The canyon where Boone was captured was flooded during dam construction in the 1930s, and the exact location of the original claim has been lost to subsequent mining operations and forest growth. However, archived newspaper accounts and surviving fragments of official documents provide enough detail to reconstruct the basic sequence of events. The case of Caleb Rawlins, Thomas Wright, and Isaac Boone remains unique in the criminal history of the American frontier, not simply because of the bizarre nature of the crimes, but because of what it revealed about the psychological effects of extreme isolation on individuals who were already operating at the margins of civilized society. The Black Hills region in 1856 was a place where men could disappear entirely from human contact for months at a time, where the normal social structures that regulate human behavior were absent, and where the line between survival and savagery was thinner than most people preferred to acknowledge. The documents that survived from this case suggest that the three men began their partnership as a relatively normal business arrangement between individuals who shared the common goal of extracting wealth from a hostile environment. However, the isolation and stress of their situation gradually revealed psychological instabilities that might have remained dormant under different circumstances. The progression from cooperation to paranoia to violence appears to have been gradual rather than sudden, developing over months of increasingly difficult conditions and diminishing contact with the outside world. What transforms this case from a simple instance of frontier violence into something far more disturbing is the evidence that Isaac Boone's psychological breakdown did not end with the murders of his partners. His ability to maintain the fiction that Wright and Rawlins were still alive, combined with his elaborate efforts to preserve their remains and continue conversations with them, suggests a form of psychological adaptation that allowed him to avoid confronting the reality of his actions. The fact that he was able to function in this delusional state for more than a year, continuing to work the claim and even defending it against perceived threats, indicates a level of psychological complexity that territorial authorities were completely unprepared to understand or address. The physical evidence discovered during the investigation painted a picture of escalating ritualistic behavior that went far beyond the immediate aftermath of the murders. Boone had apparently spent months developing increasingly elaborate methods of interacting with his victims' remains, creating scenarios and conversations that allowed him to maintain the illusion that his partners were still present and participating in their shared enterprise. The bizarre constructions found throughout the region suggested that he had expanded these rituals to encompass a much larger area, possibly in response to his growing paranoia about outside threats to his delusional community. Perhaps most disturbing was the evidence that Boone's psychological state had stabilized around his delusions rather than deteriorating further. Reports from Foster's party and Crawford's investigators suggest that Boone was functioning with apparent purpose and organization, albeit within a completely false framework of reality. He was able to plan and execute complex activities, defend his territory against intruders, and maintain elaborate social interactions with his deceased partners. This suggests that his mental breakdown had not rendered him incapable of complex reasoning, but had instead created an alternative reality within which he could continue to function normally. The legal and medical authorities who dealt with Boone's case were forced to confront questions about the nature of sanity and responsibility that their training and experience had not prepared them to answer. Boone clearly understood the difference between right and wrong in abstract terms, and he was capable of sophisticated planning and execution of complex tasks. However, his fundamental understanding of reality was so severely distorted that normal legal concepts of responsibility seemed inadequate. The territory's legal system ultimately handled the case by treating Boone as both criminally responsible and mentally incompetent, a compromise that reflected the limitations of 19th-century understanding of psychological disorders rather than any coherent legal or medical principle. The broader implications of the case extended beyond the immediate legal and medical questions. The Black Hills region in the 1850s was populated by men who had deliberately removed themselves from normal social contact in pursuit of individual wealth. The isolation and competitive pressures of frontier mining created conditions that were psychologically challenging even for individuals with stable mental health. The Boone case suggested that some individuals might be particularly vulnerable to psychological breakdown under these conditions, and that the early warning signs of such breakdown might be difficult to recognize in an environment where eccentric behavior and social withdrawal were relatively common. The impact of the case on subsequent development of the region was significant. Prospectors and settlers who arrived during the later gold rush period were aware of the story and took precautions to avoid the kinds of extreme isolation that had contributed to the original tragedy. Mining claims were established with greater attention to maintaining contact with neighboring operations, and territorial authorities implemented systems for periodic checking on remote settlements. These changes may have prevented similar incidents, though the harsh conditions and social pressures of frontier mining continued to produce various forms of violence and psychological breakdown throughout the gold rush era. The case also contributed to evolving understanding of the psychological challenges faced by individuals in extreme isolation. The detailed documentation of Boone's behavior provided early evidence of what would later be recognized as forms of psychological adaptation to prolonged stress and isolation. His ability to maintain complex delusions while functioning effectively within those delusions became a subject of study for physicians and legal scholars who were beginning to develop more sophisticated understanding of mental illness and its relationship to criminal behavior. From a historical perspective, the Boone case represents a unique window into the psychological realities of frontier life that were rarely documented with such detail. Most accounts of frontier violence focus on the immediate circumstances of specific crimes, rather than the longer-term psychological and social factors that contributed to those events. The extensive investigation and documentation of Boone's case, combined with the bizarre nature of his psychological adaptation, provides insights into the human costs of frontier expansion that are not available from other sources. The physical evidence of the case disappeared decades ago, lost to development, natural disaster, and the passage of time. However, the documentary record that survived provides enough detail to reconstruct not just the sequence of events, but the psychological and social dynamics that transformed a routine business partnership into one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American frontier history. The story of Caleb Rawlins, Thomas Wright, and Isaac Boone serves as a reminder that the conquest of the American wilderness extracted psychological as well as physical costs from those who participated in it, and that some individuals paid prices that extended far beyond the immediate dangers of frontier life. The summer of 1859 brought news that would provide a final haunting postscript to the Boone case. A surveying party working in the Black Hills region reported discovering what appeared to be recent evidence of human habitation in the remote canyon where Boone had been captured 2 years earlier. The site had been flooded during spring snowmelt and was supposedly inaccessible, yet the surveyors found clear indications that someone had been living there within the previous few months. More disturbing was their discovery of crude markers arranged around the site, each bearing initials that matched those of the original victims. The markers appeared to have been constructed recently, using materials that had not been available during Boone's occupation of the canyon. The surveyor's report suggested that someone else had taken up residence in the location and was continuing the ritualistic activities that had characterized Boone's final years. Territorial authorities dispatched an investigation party, but by the time they reached the canyon, all evidence of recent habitation had vanished. The site appeared to have been deliberately cleaned, with any traces of recent activity carefully removed or concealed. No explanation for these discoveries was ever established, and the case file was officially closed later that year. Local residents continued to report unexplained incidents in the region for several decades following the official conclusion of the case. Travelers reported hearing voices and seeing lights in areas that were known to be uninhabited. Several prospectors claimed to have encountered a figure matching Boone's description, despite the fact that Boone had died in territorial custody years earlier. These reports were generally attributed to local folklore and the psychological effects of isolation, though some investigators noted disturbing consistencies in the descriptions provided by independent witnesses. The legend of Isaac Boone became part of the oral tradition of the Black Hills region, passed down through generations of miners, settlers, and travelers. The story evolved over time, acquiring supernatural elements and dramatic embellishments that obscured the documented facts of the original case. However, the core elements of the story remained consistent: a warning about the psychological dangers of isolation and the human capacity for self-deception in the face of unbearable reality. By the 1880s, the areas associated with the Boone case had been largely integrated into the expanding settlements of the Black Hills region. The original claim sites were lost to subsequent mining operations, and the canyon where Boone had made his final stand was eventually developed for other uses. The physical traces of one of the most disturbing cases in American frontier history were erased by progress and time, leaving only fragmentary documentary records and persistent local legends. Modern investigators have attempted to reconstruct the case using surviving documents and archaeological evidence, but the passage of time and the destruction of original evidence have made definitive analysis impossible. What remains is a story that continues to challenge easy explanations and simple moral judgments. The case of Caleb Rawlins, Thomas Wright, and Isaac Boone serves as a dark reminder that the American frontier was shaped not just by courage, ambition, and enterprise, but by psychological forces that pushed some individuals beyond the boundaries of sanity and civilized behavior. The Black Hills today bear no obvious traces of the events of 1856 and 1857. Visitors to the region find a landscape that has been transformed by more than a century of development, mining, tourism, and conservation efforts. However, local historians and folklore enthusiasts continue to mark the general areas where these events occurred, and occasional efforts are made to locate specific sites mentioned in surviving documents. These investigations have yielded little concrete evidence, but they serve to keep alive the memory of a case that revealed uncomfortable truths about human psychology and the costs of frontier ambition. The story of Isaac Boone and his victims remains relevant not simply as a historical curiosity, but as an example of how extreme circumstances can reveal psychological capabilities that challenge conventional understanding of human behavior. Boone's ability to maintain complex delusions while functioning effectively within those delusions provides insights into the human capacity for psychological adaptation that remain relevant to modern understanding of mental illness and trauma response. The case serves as a reminder that the line between sanity and madness may be thinner and more permeable than most people prefer to believe. In the end, the most disturbing aspect of the Boone case may not be the violence that occurred during that terrible winter of 1856, but the evidence that one human being was capable of adapting to the aftermath of that violence in ways that allowed him to continue functioning for more than a year while maintaining elaborate relationships with his victims' remains. The psychological mechanisms that enabled this adaptation remain poorly understood, and the case continues to raise questions about the nature of reality, responsibility, and the human capacity for self-deception that have no easy answers. The canyon where Isaac Boone made his final stand lies beneath the waters of a modern reservoir, and the claims where Caleb Rawlins and Thomas Wright sought their fortunes have been lost to subsequent development. However, the questions raised by their story continue to echo through the Black Hills region and beyond. What transforms ordinary individuals into perpetrators of extraordinary violence? How do human beings adapt to psychological trauma that exceeds their capacity to process and understand? What happens to moral responsibility when reality itself becomes negotiable? These questions remain as relevant today as they were in 1857, when territorial authorities struggled to understand and respond to a case that challenged every assumption they held about human psychology and criminal behavior. The story of the Boone case serves as a permanent reminder that the conquest of the American frontier involved not just physical challenges and dangers, but psychological costs that some individuals were unable or unwilling to pay within the boundaries of sanity and civilized behavior. Perhaps that is the ultimate legacy of Caleb Rawlins, Thomas Wright, and Isaac Boone, a demonstration that human psychology is capable of adaptations that defy easy categorization and moral judgment. Their story continues to resonate more than a century and a half after the events that made them notorious, serving as a dark mirror that reflects aspects of human nature that most people prefer not to acknowledge or confront. In the end, the most terrifying element of their story may be its reminder that the capacity for such psychological adaptation lies dormant within ordinary individuals, waiting for circumstances extreme enough to call it forth. And in the silence of the Black Hills, where the wind still whispers through pine forests that have grown over forgotten claims and abandoned dreams, some say that on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the forest is still, you can hear voices carrying on conversations that should have ended more than a century ago. Whether these voices represent the persistence of guilt, the echo of unfinished business, or something else entirely, remains a question that each listener must answer for themselves.